Good morning once again. Sifu Sylvain Chamberlain with you. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. So today I want to talk to you about a question that I see repeating itself a lot in different forms. Well, really, throughout my entire practice and teaching time in different forms of leadership, I've seen it come up a lot on Quora, Quora.com. I've seen it come up various places, various ways during my practice and leadership. And I respect the question. I think it makes a lot of sense. But bottom line is, what is enlightenment? What are we working toward? What is the end goal here? What is all this effort about? Okay, I know. And see, the question persists, I think, because of two reasons. I think there's an inherent difference in the way the Western world teaches and learns, because I personally fundamentally believe that there is no teaching without learning. Learning is where the teaching happens. So it's a self-involved with a facilitator, a guidance. I resist the word teacher, but I understand that in English we identify, this from that. Which is part and parcel of our entire problem of understanding and what Buddhism is trying to disassemble. We've manifested in language. Read Alan Watts if you want more on that. And the way learning happens in Asia, in what we would call the East. And the basic difference, as Alan states it, and I think he's accurate, is that, I will paraphrase it my own way. So I like to own my words. Unreliable as words are, still. We tend to teach in the West the answer first, followed by the methods of arriving at that answer. And the tertiary goal, if it's even stated, is that the student from that formula will develop the ability to basically think on their own. So we give them the answer. We give them ways of arriving at the answer, sometimes multiple, sometimes not. And we hope that the student, through repetition of this methodology, will spark their own creativity as to perhaps finding a different way, or how to apply methodologies to find other answers. And that's pretty much Western teaching. Whereas, and these are general statements, and of course there's exceptions, but in general. Whereas teaching in Asia, especially historical teaching in Asia, and of course I'm talking about Buddhism, but I'm talking about all teaching, the position is rather to teach the student problems without resolution, to guide the student to think in different ways, or in specific or parameterized ways, to then arrive at a conclusion and let them analyze their own path or methods of arriving at that conclusion, given the set of thinking problems they've been given. So it's kind of flipped around. And for the Western student of Buddhism, this can be very confusing. And this is part of what my talks have been around lately, is how to learn or how to study the sutra, the different sutras, and the commentaries on Buddhism. Because what Buddhism is a dialogue. And that's very key to understanding what the solution is, what enlightenment is, what we're all shooting for. See, in the West, give me the answer. You're showing me how to get there, you're giving me all these methods, but what's the answer, so that then I can go, oh, and try to dissect that and learn how to think about it. Well, that's not how Buddhism is taught. It's taught by giving you the problems to solve, so that at the end of solving the problem, you'll have an aha and go, oh, I get it. That's what I'm doing. And that's where I'm going with this. So being a Westerner myself, and being raised around a great deal of Asian communities growing up in Canada and the United States, just by virtue of being around martial arts and other schools of thought, Asian schools of thought, and obviously taking my vows in Buddhism almost 30 years ago. I would like to be someone who creates a bridge of sorts to help the Westerner understand what looks sometimes even tiresome about Asian teaching. So that's what this video is about. I don't know how far I'll get, how much I'll succeed. All my videos are basically have that mindset as I enter into them, but I understand that it doesn't always translate well. I partly because I'm ineffectual at it, because I'm rather enamored with the Asian way of learning. So I have to remind myself that I'm a Westerner. And so I was recently rereading or reading the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 Lines. Translation by Edward Conze. Let me see if I'm saying that right. It's, yeah, C-O-N-Z-E. Or C-O-N-Z-E, depending on where you're from. Conze. Edward Conze. His translation is unique. It's early 20th century. And it made me think that it might be helpful for a Westerner to understand, and I'm going to say some of the same things you've heard me say before, but the context is going to change here. And I want to give you a couple of thought experiments. We wrestle a lot in our lives, Buddhism or no, with who we are. What am I? Who am I? Those questions. And Buddhism, if nothing else, is completely dedicated to resolving this issue of the I. The I, letter I, the big I. Me, myself, and I, not the I. E-Y-E. And while I bring that up, let me make my first thought experiment. We say, and language is a strong construct to convince us of this illusion, that I see, I speak, I walk, I eat, I move. Everything is a noun, or in this case, pronoun, and a verb. So the action and the intimation of an identity is intimately connected to action. So I'm going to use an example I've heard before. When you say I see, Buddhism deconstructs, and this is actually the method of Buddhist teachings, infinite deconstruction of what we attempt to own through language, which is a huge fallacy. So, for instance, when you say I see, that implies that you're in your brain somewhere manipulating the cones and rods in the retina of your eye as light comes through the prism of your lens, your cornea, so that you can type in digital code to go down the optic nerve so that your processing center, your brain, can decide what to manufacture of it to make, intimate, and interpret some kind of a form with several attributes that you can then negotiate your I with, create a relationship with other. And the reality is, when you say I see, that's not what you're doing at all. That what you're doing, in as point in fact, is observing from your I space in your mind, with your human mind, observing something happening. This is why you may start to understand differently now why Buddhism calls this I consciousness. It's an independent thing that's happening. Okay? Like hearing consciousness, taste consciousness, smelling consciousness, touching consciousness. They are independent aggregates of activity that create a specific kind of experience, or call them happenings, and cumulatively the happenings all work together to create another layer called experience, which I observe. It's kind of like if you've ever been to Ben and Jerry's, and they're not the only ones who do this anymore, but just as an example, if you've not been there, I'll describe the activity. You will pick an ice cream, let's just say it's vanilla, and they'll put a big slab, let's say you order a 5-gallon bucket of it, okay? And they'll spread that big slab all over of ice cream, all over like a huge cutting board. And then they'll ask you to pick what you want in it. I want the Oreos, the M&Ms, and the candied almonds, and the little bits of chocolate, and so you pick all, and the nuts over here, and blah, 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 blah. And they just take big scoopfuls of each of those ingredients, and they stick them on the slab of ice cream, and then they take these big spatulas, thick spatulas, and they start folding the ice cream over into the fillings until they feel they've pretty much evened out the mixture of all the ingredients within the big glob of ice cream, and then they put that ice cream in a bucket for you, and that's your ice cream, okay? Now, if you were to replace those ingredients of the Oreos and the M&Ms and so on with eye consciousness, hearing consciousness, smell, you see where I'm going, These are ingredients that have all of their own tendencies and conditions. They have their own qualities, but amassed together like the skandhas, right? Like the aggregates. These things are containers of many, many qualities themselves. And they're all wrapped into this ice cream. And then we would flatten out that ice cream in a nice cold room so it wouldn't melt. And we would slice it up into 1,000 servings. Would each of those 1,000 servings be exactly identical? No, of course not. They'd all have the same skandhas. They'd all have the same tendencies and conditions built into them, but in different ratios. So in a way, those are all individual servings of the same thing, like human beings. Some of us have a little bit more Oreo, some of us a little bit more M&M, some of us have, so on and so forth. So the idea that we're all the same, or that the oneness we talk about in Buddhism comes from that kind of a thinking. All right? Now, you can observe that Ben and Jerry's ice cream being made. You're not making it, but you can observe the making of it. Which again is the I. Because the ice cream and the ingredients isn't you. We agree, right? They're just components. And I'm separating them further for you by saying that putting them all together isn't you. It's just a bunch of stuff that you, specifically you, the I, the samsaric I, is observing. Is this starting to make sense? So you don't see, you observe a happening of seeing. And you, in combination of all those consciousnesses, are having an experience of that group of consciousnesses with all of their attendant tendencies and conditions. This is why we see things differently, because all our happenings, although very, very, very similar, are balanced by other happenings that tend to bend, fold, mutilate, warp slightly each of our experiences of the same happenings, although they are encased in the idea of an identity. When we talk about meditation, and I hear people say, well, I hate meditation, I hate sitting still, I hate the irony is that there's not a sentient being on the planet that isn't meditating already. Because what I've just described to you, this whole idea of the I is an observer of these things that are happening intimate to me. They're all, the language glues me with those actions and gives me the fallacy that I am an independent, separate thing from actions that are happening that I'm just happening to observe in a small quantity local to me. That is the ego. And that comes from our human mind. Our human mind wants desperately to grasp an identity, a beingness, from this subset of all action. So what is the goal of Buddhism? Why do we do all this? Because if we dissect it like this, we start to see ourselves differently. And if we can exist in that difference for a little while, marinate in it, and think about the implications of it, well, then the next logical question, although it may not come out of logic, but I'm going to give it to you, is how do I observe that? Or can I observe that? Or who is it that observes that? Is there a who? Is that a different I? So in other words, if you could take everything that you're learning, I'm taking a leap here, so digest this. If you understand yourself as an I, a human I, that is spending its time 24/7, 365, constantly observing and identifying with all the hermetic actions that are happening between what you think you own, that's yours, because that's all connective, and that's all you're doing all the time. Can you begin to separate yourself from it? Can you begin to actually perceive yourself as something distinct, not connected to, but distinct from all those activities? See, that distance is important. That distance is what makes you start to perceive correctly what is happening. Because if you can't put that distance, then you're just playing the game. You're just another part of the conditions and tendencies, that's samsara. That's why we're never satisfied. That's why we feel pain and sorrow and sometimes ecstasies that are out of control, whatever. Because we're so tied to the actions, like somebody who's playing video games while they're crapping themselves all night in a diaper because they can't extract themselves from the video game. They're not living life. They're something else. Their I is the game. Their body's an encumbrance. Well, we're all doing the same thing. It's just a matter of perceptive alignment. So this is why Buddhism dissects everything, because through understanding the myriad levels of assumptions and tendencies and conditions of things happening, we should be able to distance ourselves from it and recognize that our attachments are what keep the I extant. The attachments to those actions is what lends our strength, our adherence quotient to the attachment. Can you distance yourself from it? By distancing yourself from and watching the actions, you can begin to perceive the degree of your attractions, your attachments to different actions of meanness. Man, my eyes are bothering me. Does that make sense? It's kind of like playing a game of checkers and, putting all those behaviors in the checkers, like the red one is red and it's wood and it's made in this shape and it rests on these squares that are just this color, and the black ones are like this, and blah, 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 blah. Give them all their properties, and each of those is an I. Now that's the next level, isn't it? Because now that you've distanced yourself from the actions that you observe, can you now distance yourself from that I? That You thought the first part was difficult. That next one, that's unfathomable. How do you watch? How do you become an observer of the samsaric eye that observes and is attached to all of these behaviors and actions and happenings and experience? How can you become an observer of that observer's experience? If you can get there in your mind, then you immediately become able to view everyone as a samsaric eye. This is where the difference between the Buddha mind, the Buddha wisdom, I'm giving those Buddhist labels to it now so you can understand, this is the tie-in, that mind that sees the samsaric mind at work can observe other minds doing the exact same thing, and that's when the differences between the I and yous breaks down. Okay? That's the first thought experiment. Now I'm going to come at it from another direction that I talked about in different ways in my 4 or 5 lectures on, or videos on the origins of life, the 3,000 realms in a single thought moment. So, I'm going to come around the other way in more of a Buddhist style of explaining this. And I'm going to say, consider the Big Bang. All of you have heard of it. Some of you have read books about it. Others of you just know that it's a theory of evolution. But basically, very basically, whatever you learned in school about the Big Bang went something like this. Everything that is in the universe was at one time in a tiny little ball that was so dense that it was so super hot and super dense that it wasn't even matter. It was just heat. Okay, Buddhism doesn't have a problem with this because in Buddhism, everything comes from energy anyway. And that's all we are, and that's why nothing that is exists in the permanent sense. Everything is an ephemeral, temporal thing that is just a form of that energy for a little while until it goes back into that form of energy. So nothing is permanent, right? Everything is fleeting. So think of the Big Bang now, in a Buddhist sense, is a thought. And a thought is an action. So a thought, immediately upon instantiating a thought, boom, there are billions of little sub-thoughts that happen. Because in order to have a thought, there has to be a realization of what that thought would entail. So immediately, it's instantaneous. There are thousands upon thousands of other thoughts that have to be resolved in order to resolve that one thought. So think of the Big Bang as this explosion of thoughts. And the thought, let's say the thought is a rose bush. It's a meaningless thought because that thought is an abstraction of, there's nothing. There's no thing. There's noumena. There's no thing. But there's a restlessness in this energy that pops up an idea. And the moment there's an idea, there's a will to perceive that idea. Read about the Nidana or Nibbana, depending on Pali or Sanskrit. The 12-linked causal chain. That's what it is. There's from nothing an idea And that idea has to have form. By nature of an idea, it has a form, and that form needs to be named language. That form needs to be named. Why? Because that's what differentiates it from everything else. In this case, nothing. No thing. If there's a thing, the moment there's a thought of a thing, the thought is a thing. The moment the thing happens, then it has to be defined. And in order to be defined, it has to be something other. This is the condition of samsara, right there at the beginning. And as the thoughts collect, to say rosebush is leaves, green, sticks, flower, petals, dirt, worms in the dirt. All the conditions and tendencies need to be made as billions of thoughts come together to construct things like DNA so the rosebush can exist. This happens in an instant. And guess what else you need if you want a rose bush? You need a solar system. You need an earth. You need a sun. You need photosynthesis. It's an unfathomable how many thoughts need to occur in order to instantiate just one idea. So do you realize what I just said? Who created the word? Who created the earth? Who? What? I? Yeah, I. That's the Buddhist I. That's the Buddha wisdom. That's the Buddha knowledge. That's the Buddha reality. Is that everything we experience, everything, all experience, let me say it like that, ultimately boils down to one simple little idea or thought that motivated and precipitated countless other things to instantiate in order to realize itself. And what do we know about thoughts and ideas once they instantiate? Once you paint the painting, once you draw the drawing, once you bake the cake, once you build the house, it's pretty much left to decay until it just goes away. This is the nature of everything in Buddhism. Things arise and fall away. That's it. So now you might ask, so why Buddhism? Okay, I get that. It's kind of depressing. Why Buddhism? So as much as Buddhism dissects and defines all of this process, and it's rather amazing that almost 3,000 years ago, Buddha was defining a reality that quantum physics is now trying to explain in scientific terms. Shakyamuni's goal was never that we all become incredible cosmologists and biologists and scientists, that we could understand the nature of everything. But having a clue as to the nature of everything is what helps us to understand how best to live this life. I've said it before, Shakyamuni was a pragmatist. He wasn't trying to solve all the mysteries of the universe. He was only trying to solve the mystery of how can we have a life free of dis-ease, discomfort, the feeling that we're never going to get there, the feeling that we're somehow inadequate or not fulfilled. How can we live a life knowing that every single part of it is precious and beautiful, and just live a life of appreciation? Because that's what we should be doing. Why should we be doing that? How should we be doing that? Well, because the mind is endlessly processing these zillions of thoughts, even if they're mostly not even in our immediate conscious mind. We need a method to quiet down our human mind from thinking all the stuff it doesn't need to think. And the only way to do that is to just make it known. Look at the guy behind the curtain. My battery's getting low. Must be talking a long time. And focus in simply on the things that are to be enjoyed in this short little blip of our existence in the whole, to perceive the wonder of it, the beauty of it, to watch this thought, to look at this thought, to be in this thought, really in it, not influenced and attached to a bunch of stuff that doesn't really matter or exist. Is this starting to make sense? I wrote some notes down. I'm just going to look at them in case I missed yeah, pretty much covered it. I'm going to read a little something out of the Perfection of Wisdom that talks about, I think, what I was just mentioning. And I circled it and wrote "wow" next to it because now this, what I just explained to you, I think was in very Western terms. This is going to be a Western transliteration of this sutra that was written thousands of years ago. And maybe you'll be able to compare it with what I just said, and maybe you'll understand it differently. If you do, please comment under the video. But I think it says exactly what I've been trying to say. Now, at this point in the dialogue, Buddhism is a dialogue, they've been discussing what is a bodhisattva and what makes a bodhisattva a great being. And it's all in terms of perfection of wisdom. What's perfection of wisdom? I think it's what I just described to you. The perfection of wisdom is not a happening, a collection of happenings. It's not something that the I owns. It's something that the I, beyond the I, perceives the reality that even the I that is observing all of these happenings is empty. It's empty in the sense that they're just momentary instantiations of thoughts, and those thoughts arise and go away constantly. Okay? So Subhuti, which is one of the personas that Shakyamuni uses in his stead to teach these concepts, says, "It is clear also to me in what sense a bodhisattva is called a great being." So Shakyamuni says, "Then make it clear what you think now." So Subhuti says, "A bodhisattva is called a great being if he remains unattached to and uninvolved with, or in, the thought of enlightenment. the words are critical here, even though the Buddha tells you constantly not to focus in on the words but the meaning. But the construct of words are important to understand the meaning. The thought of enlightenment. In other words, to be so removed as to understand that enlightenment isn't even the goal, because enlightenment is a thought that arises and goes away. So, I'll go on. If he remains unattached to and uninvolved in the thought of enlightenment, the thought of all knowledge, the thought without outflows, the unequaled thought, the thought which equals the unequaled, unshared by any of the disciples or Pratyeka Buddhas, because that thought of all knowledge is itself without outflows and unincluded in the empirical world. In the empirical world, samsara. And in respect of that thought of all knowledge, which is without outflows and unincluded, he remains unattached and uninvolved. In that sense does a bodhisattva come to be styled a great being. Shariputra says, for what reason is he unattached even to that thought and uninvolved in it? Right? And Subhuti says, because it is no thought. Because, see, thought is a thing. Shariputra, is that thought, which is no thought, something which is? Oh my goodness. Amazing, amazing rhetorical arguments in Buddhism. When you really stop to consider exactly what's being discussed. Subhuti, does there exist or can one apprehend in this state of absence of thought either there is or there is not? Shariputra says, no, not that. Subhuti, how then can the Venerable Shariputra say, quote, is that thought which is no thought something which is? How can he ask that question when there's no thought? Shariputra, well, do you expound this, you whom Shakyamuni has announced as the foremost of those who dwell in peace? Thereupon the Venerable Purna, son of Maitrayani, said to Shakyamuni, great being, one who is so called, armed with the great armor is that being. He sets out in the great vehicle, is mounted on the great vehicle. That is why he comes to be styled a great being. Subhuti, how great is that which entitles him to be called armed with the great armor? So, now these are all similes, right? The great armor is what? The great armor is a protection against slipping into the illusion that there is an I that contains all these tendencies and conditions as a permanent state, as a self and other, as a duality. There's this temporal thing happening of experience through the illusion of all of these things that's from the duality, is samsaric conditions that all of these thoughts have of wanting to instantiate, and yet they're just thoughts. They're just going to go away. So he's protected from getting attached to that as a reality. He's just an observer. So that's the great armor. So Shakyamuni says, here the Bodhisattva, the great being, thinks thusly. Countless beings should I lead to nirvana, and yet there are none who lead to nirvana, or who should be led to it. However many beings he may lead to nirvana, yet there is not any being that has been led to nirvana, nor that has to lead others to it, including himself. For such is the true nature of dharmas, seeing that their nature is illusory. Just as if Subhuti, a clever magician or magician's apprentice, were to conjure up at the crossroads a great crowd of people and then make them vanish again. What do you think, Subhuti? Was anyone killed by anyone, or murdered, or destroyed, or made to vanish? Subhuti, no, indeed. So those are the kind of passages sometimes you find yourself reading over and over again. Did I get that? Did I get what he just said? So let me interpret it a little bit. Because in Mahayana Buddhism, our stated goal is to achieve the state of bodhisattva. What is that? So a state of bodhisattva is, as I was describing earlier, a state of mind that is removed from the idea that there is an extant I, and that I and its attendant attachments is what enforces the perception of that I, and is protected from being attached to that. Not only is protected from being attached to that, but realizes that there is no attachment to begin with, because the bodhisattva is just a conceptual thought in this samsaric plane that's provisional. And in this provisional temporary state of knowing, he can facilitate and help the others who are attached to walk away from their attachments and come to a place where he or she is, as a bodhisattva, an observer that doesn't exist. And therefore, if you live in the samsaric conditions as somebody who is unattached because you are not something to attach to begin with, you're immediately released. You're liberated from all that drama. Or as is often repeated in Buddhist teachings, suffering. Not a very good word, but it's kind of a capsule. Are any lights going off? So you see, our whole goal, pragmatically, in this life, is to shift our understanding about our activities every day, our ourness. And if we can see with ultimate detachment. Now, I know in English when we say we have no attachments, it kind of makes us a dull, kind of depressing, unmotivated, unfeeling, unkind person. But quite to the contrary. If you remove yourself from all the drama, all the decisions, all the myriad thoughts constantly flying through your brain, and let them be like a toy. An Eldon Raceway said, let them just go on being. You can actually enjoy watching the game. And because it doesn't affect you, you're free to enjoy it. Because it doesn't touch you. It just becomes a beautiful little garden. And we all know the garden will die come fall. The conditions will change and their tendencies won't work and they'll just fall away. But that doesn't make them ugly or sorrowful. It just means they're done playing. you as well. That's life. That's the process. From the grandest cosmology to the smallest, tiniest instantiation of thought, it's all the same. This is where our Buddhist compassion comes from. Like a parent watching a helpless child trying to do stuff. It's endlessly entertaining. And it comes with a little bit of sorrow. Because it's momentary. But that doesn't take away from its beauty and its joy. And that's all that we're here for. I think that's pretty amazing. Pretty big stuff. Anyway, I hope that helps stir some kind of thinking in you, and study, because it's all in the sutras. It really is. You just have to learn how to pick it out. Of these wonderful word games and puzzles that constantly repeat the same truth. Anyway, I love you all. I can't help it because I love myself. And there we are again. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Comments below. Let me know what you think. I appreciate you. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Hey. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful life, a wonderful moment.